Hi, I'm Susan Brubaker-Knapp, and in the next hour or so, I'm going to teach you the basics of painting realistic subjects on fabric. All of my pieces that you see here are whole cloth painted pieces, and that means I start with a base layer of fabric and cover it with paint first. And then I go in and add a lot of stitching with thread. And you can see here that I do add a good amount of detail with the thread, and some of that detail I add with thread sketching that's done just on the surface of the fabric before I add the batting and the backing. And I have a lot more details about that process in my DVDs, Master Machine Stitching and Master Machine Quilting. So if you're interested in that part of it, those DVDs will give you more guidance. We're going to go into a lot of detail today about the painting part. So this is the main project we're going to work on today. It's a still life with cherries on a plate. And I chose this subject partly because I wanted to be able to show light reflecting off of the surface and how I address that. And also shading, and adding highlights. And also adding some texture in the background here. Here's another piece where I actually painted the fish on fabric first, and then I appliqued them down to the background. So it's not truly a whole cloth painted piece, but it's a nice way to use the technique on a different kind of quilt. And here's another example of a piece that I painted, and you can see here that I used some metallic paints. We're going to talk about that in a minute. So let's talk about the materials that you're going to need to get before you get started in this process. The most basic one is probably fabric. And here I've got some fabrics that work great for whole cloth painting. And they're basically cotton fabrics with a very tight weave, a high thread count. And they're also PFD, or prepared for dyeing fabrics. That's important because usually fabric manufacturers put a finish on the surface of the fabric, and that the paint resists against that, so it doesn't get sucked into the fibers as much. So these two, this MDSP and the MDYE, are both by P&B Fabrics. And this one is called Pimatex. It's by Robert Kaufman. All of these are excellent choices for whole cloth painting. You will want to get some kind of a palette. And this one is a ceramic one, but there are great ones made with plastic or metal. And if you really want to go cheap at the beginning, you can just use a piece of parchment paper or freezer paper and mix your paints there. But it is nice to have one that has a lot of compartments here, because if you're working on a piece and you have lots of colors that you need to be using simultaneously, or tints or shades of a color, it's great to have a lot of different sections where you can mix your paint. Brushes, also very important. Now, I brought a bunch of different brushes here, and I'll show you some of the differences in them. You may have brushes that you use for other crafts at home. It's very important to get the right brushes that will work for this process. If you have brushes like this one, can you see how the tips, the bristles, are very flexible? They bend really easily. This is not a good choice for whole cloth painting because you really need a brush that can push the pigments of the paint into the fabric, and this is just too loose, so this is not going to work. The other one that is not going to work in this batch is this one right here. It has really long bristles. This is an inexpensive brush, and it could work if I cut it off. And sometimes I buy brushes and I actually trim them. Let me show you what I do. See how long these bristles are? That means that they're more flexible. But if we trim them, they become less flexible. So I just take scissors. I don't do this with expensive brushes, by the way. And I trim it down. And I'm going to trim it down to about 1/4 of an inch. And I want to try to get it as straight as possible. See how there's some little snaggles there? I can just go back in, trim it down a little bit more. Sometimes you can kind of custom cut brushes for whatever you need to do in your project. So now this is a lot more usable, all right? The next thing you're going to want to think about is what kind of, how wide the brushes are and the type of tip. And you can see that these, maybe if I hold it up, it'll be a little bit better. See how this one is flat and then it has a very wide surface here? These brushes come in lots of different widths. And this brush is a low Cornell brush that is designed for fabric dye. So fabric dyes and paints work great with these brushes. Here's another one, and this is also a low Cornell, but this one has a more rounded tip on it. And I buy brushes that are large and small. Let me hold up. Some of them are teeny tiny with only a few bristles there. You're going to need a lot of different ones. If you're working on a large piece, for example, like my orchid piece here that's about 2 by 3, I needed to cover a lot of ground. So I would have used this brush to cover a lot of ground in some of these big areas. And if I were doing detail work, like we're going to do on this piece, can you see all the very small details? Because it's a smaller piece, I'm going to be using smaller brushes. So I'm going to be using this brush and this brush a lot more on that piece. The next thing to think about is paint. And there are a lot of different brands of paint out there. The main thing you want is to get a soft-bodied acrylic paint. So that's not the kind that comes in the tubes. It's the kind that comes in bottles like this. The kind that comes in the tubes is kind of the consistency of toothpaste. It's a little bit too thick, so it doesn't go into the fibers of the fabric very well. What you're looking for is something that's the consistency of sour cream, and when you shake it, it makes a little noise, a gloppy noise. So it's fairly liquidy. Now, there are different types of paint, and I'm not talking about brands, I'm talking about types of paint. There are some that are opaque paints, which very much cover the surface. There are some semi-transparent paints that allow you to layer them because the paint that's on the bottom layer where the fabric is, then it allows the top layers to show through a little bit more. So those are semi-transparent paints. There are also metallic paints. This is Lumiere by Jacquard. It's a metallic paint. We've got Stuart Gill makes a lot of different kinds of paints and very high pigment base in their paints. There is Cetacolor. This is Studio by Diane Helmuth. Liquitex. What else do we have here? So we have some Pro Chemical and Dye. And all of these are good choices. They all are slightly different, and I think you'll find that as you paint more, you'll kind of develop a preference for one of them. A lot of people also ask me about extenders and fabric medium. Now, extenders come in bottles like this, and they're used partly to keep the paint moist, because if you're working on a piece for a long time, you don't want your paints to dry out too much. And you don't want to add water to them either, or at least not too much water. If you add a lot of water to these acrylic paints, they'll get so liquidy that they will bleed on your fabric. You know, when you put them down, they will start to spread out and bleed onto the fabric. So the extenders help avoid that, because you can add a little bit of that. It keeps your paint moist, but you still have the control when you start to paint that you wouldn't have if you had added water. And the textile mediums and fabric mediums, they're good if you want to maintain the hand of your fabric. That is not as important to me as it is to some people, because I kind of like it that the fabric makes the surface a little bit crisper, because it acts as a stabilizer, so that when I start to stitch, I have a nice stable surface to work with. And so if you want your fabric to be very soft and pliable after it's painted, you might consider using a fabric medium like that. Another thing you're going to need is a glass filled with water, or about halfway filled with water, to wash out your brushes. There's a really good way to wash out your brushes and dry your brushes, and a not so good way, which we're going to talk about in the next segment. And you also want to have a couple of rags on hand, because you're going to get messy. And in the next segment, we're going to talk a little bit about preparing working from a photo and getting ready to paint.